The battlefield was a graveyard of fire and metal. Smoke curled into the toxic sky as explosions shook the ground, sending debris and charred bodies flying. Captain Elias Carter pushed forward, his rifle clutched tight in his hands, sweat and blood trickling down his forehead. His squad was scattered, their voices crackling through his comms, filled with fear, pain, and the desperate need to survive. But deep down, they all knew the truth. This wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. Dravos 9 had been the last stronghold in this sector, a human colony fortified to withstand anything the Excelsior Empire could throw at it. The war had raged for years, but no one had expected the enemy to deploy orbital bombardment. They hadn't even given a warning. One moment, the colony stood proud. The next, it was a smoldering ruin. Elias dove behind the wreckage of a fallen dropship, his heart pounding as an enemy scout drone hovered nearby, its glowing red eye sweeping over the ruins. He held his breath, the heat of his rifle burning against his gloved fingers. The second it turned away, he moved, silent, precise, a soldier trained to survive against impossible odds. He had to find the others. Carter, do you copy? A familiar voice rasped in his ear. Elias pressed his earpiece. Bonner, where the hell are you? Pinned near the command center. Those AI bastards are cutting through our defenses. It's bad, man. We gotta. The transmission cut off in a burst of static. Elias gritted his teeth. He had fought beside Sergeant Bonner for 6 years. The man was more than a squad mate. He was a brother. Without thinking, he sprinted toward the remains of the command center, weaving through the ruins, his boots crunching over broken glass and scorched metal. The air reeked of death. Bodies, human and alien, lay scattered, some still clutching their weapons, others torn apart by plasma fire. A shadow loomed ahead. Elias froze, pressing himself against the wreckage. A Excelsior war machine. The towering mech moved with deadly grace, its sleek, black armor lined with pulsating blue energy. Its eye-controlled turrets scanned the ruins, searching for survivors. One wrong move, and Elias would be vaporized. Sweat dripped down his face as he waited, barely breathing. The moment it turned, he bolted, ducking, rolling, weaving through the destruction. He was close. He could see the collapsed remains of the command center now, fire licking at the shattered walls. Then he saw him. Bonner was slumped against a fallen pillar, his rifle limp in his hands. A deep plasma wound had burned through his chest. His breath was ragged, shallow. He wasn't going to make it. Elias skidded to his knees, gripping his friend's vest. "Hold on, buddy. We're getting out of here." Bonner's eyes flickered open, a weak smile tugging at his lips. "Not this time, you stubborn bastard." He coughed, blood staining his teeth. Elias shook his head, his throat tight. "I won't leave you here. Then you'll die too." Bonner's grip on his arm weakened. His voice was barely a whisper now. "Get out of here, Carter. Live. For both of us." A deafening explosion shook the ground. More Excelsior forces were closing in. The mech turned, its scanners locking onto their position. Elias had no choice. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to step back. Bonner's eyes met his one last time. A silent goodbye. Then the mech fired. A blinding flash, a deafening roar. Bonner was gone. Elias was thrown back by the blast, his ears ringing, his vision blurred. Pain shot through his ribs, his legs barely able to move. But he wasn't dead. Not yet. Somehow, he forced himself up, stumbling through the ruins like a ghost. His squad was gone. His mission was over. There was no one left to save. That's when he saw her. She was barely visible beneath the rubble, her body half buried in debris. Purple blood stained her silver armor, her breathing faint. A Excelsior warrior, but not like the others. Her features were more delicate, her form built for agility rather than brute strength. Her armor flickered with failing cloaking technology, a sign that she was meant to be unseen. She was dying. abandoned by her own people. Elias should have walked away. She was the enemy, after all. But as he stared at her, broken and alone, something inside him shifted. He had just watched his best friend die, his squad wiped out. He knew what it felt like to be left behind. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was madness. But Elias made a choice. He moved toward her, ignoring the screams of his own injuries. Carefully, he pried the rubble off her, lifting her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her breath shallow against his neck. Her silver eyes fluttered open for a brief second, confusion and pain clouding them. She tried to speak, but no words came. Then she passed out. Elias adjusted his grip and took a shaky step forward. The Excelsior were still hunting. The war wasn't over. And now he had a new mission. Survive, protect her, and find out why the hell he just staved an enemy soldier. Elias pushed through the ruins, his arms burning as he carried the wounded alien girl across the battlefield. Smoke curled into the sky, the air thick with the scent of charred metal and death. Every step sent pain shooting up his legs, his injuries catching up to him. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. The Excelsior war machines were still sweeping the area, hunting for survivors. If he stopped now, they were both dead. The girl's body was light, almost too light, as if her bones were made for speed rather than brute strength. Blood, a deep shade of violet, trickled from a wound on her side, staining his already ruined armor. She was breathing, but barely. He didn't even know why he had saved her. She was the enemy, the same species that had wiped out his squad without a second thought. The same ones responsible for Bonner's death. He should have left her there, but something in him refused. Maybe it was because she had been left behind, just like he had. He reached the remains of an abandoned outpost, its structure barely intact, walls cracked and scorched. It was dangerous to stop here, but he needed cover. With careful movements, he lowered her onto the cold metal floor, propping her up against a broken console. His body screamed in protest, every muscle aching from exhaustion and blood loss. He had lost count of how many wounds he had. All he knew was that he was still alive. The girl stirred, a low, pained groan escaping her lips. Elias tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. He didn't know how she would react once she woke up. She was Excelsior, trained to kill humans. And here he was, the only human around. Her silver eyes fluttered open, hazy with pain and confusion. For a moment, she didn't move, her gaze unfocused. Then, realization hit. She lunged. Elias barely had time to react before she was on him, her hands gripping his throat, her strength shocking despite her injuries. He gritted his teeth, grabbing her wrists, trying to pry them off, but her grip was strong, too strong for someone on the brink of death. Her breath was ragged, her body trembling, but her eyes burned with fury. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse, weak, but filled with hostility. Elias growled, twisting free and shoving her back against the console. "I just saved your damn life, and this is the thanks I get." She gasped for breath, her hands pressing against her wounded side. Blood seeped between her fingers, her strength faltering for a second. But her glare never wavered. "You should have let me die, human." Elias scoffed, rubbing his sore neck. "Trust me, I considered it." He grabbed his rifle from the floor and aimed it at her, his finger resting on the trigger. "Now tell me, why were you left behind?" She hesitated. He saw it in her eyes, the flicker of something deeper, shame, anger. He wasn't sure. Then she clenched her jaw. "My unit was ambushed during the attack. I was wounded. They deemed me useless." Elias exhaled slowly. He knew that Excelsior were ruthless, but abandoning their own, that was a level of cruelty even he hadn't expected. She shifted, wincing in pain, and leaned against the wall. "You're wasting your time keeping me alive." Elias narrowed his eyes. Yeah, well, I don't plan on dying alone, sweetheart. And right now, you're the only company I've got. She gave him a sharp look, her expression unreadable. Silence stretched between them, the only sound the distant rumble of explosions. Then she spoke. My name is Lyra. Elias hesitated. Elias Carter. Neither of them reached out for a handshake. Instead, Elias sighed and lowered his rifle. Look, I don't trust you, and I know damn well you don't trust me. But the Excelsior are still out there, and if they find us, we're both dead. So, unless you want to bleed out here, we need to work together. Lyra's jaw tightened. I don't ally with humans. Elias smirked. You'd rather ally with the bastards who left you to die. Her eyes flickered with something. Hurt, maybe, but she didn't answer. Elias took that as a small victory. He grabbed his pack and pulled out a field medkit. Hold still. She eyed him warily. What are you doing? Stopping you from dying, genius. He pulled out a disinfectant injector and pressed it against her wound. She flinched as it hissed, the pain evident on her face, but she didn't complain. He worked quickly, wrapping a bandage around her side, his fingers brushing against her smooth, silvery skin. It was strange, seeing an alien up close like this. She looked so human, yet everything about her, from her slightly elongated limbs to the faint bioluminescent lines tracing her collarbone, was different. When he was done, he leaned back. There, you'll live. She looked at the bandage, then at him. You're a fool. Elias smirked. Been called worse. Before she could respond, a metallic screech echoed through the ruins. Elias' blood ran cold. The Excelsior war machines were near. He grabbed his rifle and peered through a broken window. Shadows moved through the smoke, tall, sleek figures with glowing eyes. Eye-controlled hunters. Lyra stiffened. They're searching for survivors. Elias didn't take his eyes off them. Then we better make sure they don't find us. She looked at him, something unreadable in her gaze. Then, slowly, she nodded. For the first time, they were on the same side. Elias gripped his rifle tight, his heartbeat hammering in his ears as the mechanical screeches echoed through the ruins. The Excelsior war machines were closing in, their sleek metallic bodies moving with an eerie precision through the smoke-filled landscape. Their glowing red optics cut through the darkness like hunting beacons. He turned to Lyra. Her silver eyes flickered with a mix of pain and urgency. She might have been wounded, but she wasn't weak. She pressed her hand against her side, wincing, but the resolve on her face was clear. She wasn't going to let herself be captured. Can you move? Elias whispered. She shot him a glare but gave a small nod. I'll manage. They didn't have a choice. Staying here meant death. Elias pressed himself against the cracked wall of the outpost, peeking through a gap. The war machines were scanning the area, their sharp, insect-like limbs clicking against the rubble as they moved. They were designed for hunting. If one spotted them, it wouldn't stop until they were dead. Lyra shifted beside him. We need a distraction, she murmured. Elias frowned. Unless you have a grenade hidden somewhere, I don't see how we're gonna distract a damn death squad. Her gaze flicked to a fallen Excelsior soldier a few meters away. The corpse was still clutching the plasma rifle. Cover me, she said. Before he could protest, she darted forward, swift despite her injuries. Are you serious? Elias hissed, but there was no time to stop her. She slid to the corpse, snatching the rifle, her fingers working quickly over its settings. A beeping sound activated. Elias' eyes widened. Tell me you didn't just. Lyra hurled the rifle toward the opposite side of the ruins, just as the war machines turned toward the sound. The moment it hit the ground, it exploded in a burst of violet energy, sending debris flying. The war machines twisted their heads toward the blast. Their optics flashed as they adjusted their scans, drawn toward the disturbance. Elias didn't hesitate. Move. They sprinted through the ruins, weaving between broken structures and burned-out vehicles. Every step sent jolts of pain through Elias' body, but he pushed forward. There was no room for weakness. Liara kept pace beside him, her breathing sharp and uneven. Blood still seeped from her wound, but she didn't slow down. Elias had to admit, for someone who had just tried to kill him an hour ago, she was damn resilient. The war machines detected movement. A shriek filled the air. Elias risked a glance over his shoulder. One of the hunters had locked onto them. Its sleek, metallic body blurred as it shot forward, its bladed arms slicing through rubble like paper. Faster, Elias shouted. Liara didn't need to be told twice. A beam of red energy shot past them, barely missing Elias' shoulder. They weren't going to outrun it. His eyes darted around, searching. There. A collapsed highway up ahead. The twisted remains of a transport truck jutted from the wreckage, forming a small tunnel. This way. Eris blinked, clearly caught off guard. Nyx clutched her sister's arm, her small fingers trembling. You won't leave us?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Ryan shook his head. "Not a chance." Nyx's eyes filled with tears, and before he knew what was happening, she threw herself at him, wrapping her arms around his chest. Ryan stiffened, startled, but then he slowly placed a hand on her back. She was so small, so fragile, and yet she had survived so much. Eris watched, her expression unreadable. Then, after a moment, she sighed and nodded. "Okay," she said. "We'll trust you." Ryan felt something shift in the air between them. For the first time since this nightmare began, they weren't just running together. They were a team. But as Ryan looked up at the darkened sky, he knew one thing for certain. The bounty hunters wouldn't stop. And if they wanted to protect each other, they would have to fight. The night was alive with danger. Ryan crouched behind a fallen tree, his heart pounding against his ribs as he surveyed the approaching figures. The bounty hunters had found them. He had hoped for more time, but luck was never on his side. He had counted at least 8 of them, heavily armed, armored, and moving in coordinated silence. Professionals. Eris and Nyx huddled behind him, their breathing shallow. He could feel their fear, their uncertainty. They trusted him to protect them. And he wasn't about to let them down. He tightened his grip on his rifle. He had fought impossible battles before, had faced death more times than he could count. But this was different. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. The twins had suffered enough. He wasn't going to let them go back to that nightmare. A distant voice crackled through the bounty hunter's comms. "Fan out. They're here." Ryan exhaled sharply. They were closing in, moving carefully, scanning the area with thermal optics. His standard cloak wouldn't be enough to hide from them for long. He needed a plan. His mind raced. The terrain was uneven. Scattered trees, large boulders, and a rocky cliffside to the east. If he could lead them into a bottleneck, he could control the fight. He turned his head slightly, whispering, "Stay low. Follow me." Eris nodded, gripping Nyx's hand tightly as they moved. Every step was careful, every movement calculated. Ryan led them toward the cliffside, where a narrow pass between the rocks would force the bounty hunters into a choke point. But before they could reach it, a gunshot rang out. The ground beside Ryan exploded in a burst of dirt and rock. He dove forward, pulling the twins with him as more shots followed. They had spotted him. "Move," he shouted, pushing them ahead as he spun around, raising his rifle. His fingers squeezed the trigger, and the first hunter went down with a sharp cry. Another moved in from the side, firing in controlled bursts. Ryan ducked behind a tree, returning fire. His shots were precise, aimed for the gaps in their armor. Another enemy dropped, but they kept coming. They were fast, trained, and they had numbers. Ryan gritted his teeth. He needed to even the odds. Eris and Nyx scrambled behind a large rock as Ryan reached for a grenade. He pulled the pin, counted to 2, and threw it toward the advancing hunters. A deafening explosion shook the ground. Smoke and dust filled the air. Ryan didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, using the chaos to his advantage. His knife found its mark in the throat of one hunter, his rifle taking down another before they could react. But then something hit him hard. A shockwave sent him crashing against a tree, pain exploding in his ribs. His vision blurred as he struggled to breathe. A bounty hunter loomed over him, a massive brute in reinforced armor. "You should have stayed dead, soldier," the man growled, raising his weapon. Ryan barely managed to roll aside as the gun fired. The bark of the tree behind him shattered. He kicked out, knocking the man off balance before grabbing his own knife and driving it deep into his side. The brute choked, stumbling back, and Ryan finished him with a shot to the head. But there were still more. Gunfire erupted from the cliffside as the remaining hunters regrouped. Ryan turned, trying to spot Eris and Nyx. And then he saw her. Eris stood with her arms outstretched, her body shimmering with an unnatural glow. Ryan's breath caught. The bounty hunters hesitated. What the hell? And then Eris vanished. No, she didn't disappear. She blended. The air around her rippled like a heat wave, distorting her form until she was nothing but a faint outline. Then, before the hunters could react, she struck. She moved like a ghost, silent and deadly. A dagger flashed in her hand, slicing through armor, finding weak points. One hunter screamed as his throat was cut. Another collapsed as Eris plunged her blade into his back. Ryan watched, stunned. She wasn't just hiding. She was hunting. Nyx stayed behind cover, trembling, her eyes locked on her sister. The bounty hunters, now in full panic, turned their weapons in every direction, trying to track Eris. But she was too fast, too unpredictable. Ryan took advantage of the chaos, firing at the disoriented hunters. One by one, they fell. The last hunter, wounded, desperate, turned to run. But before he could escape, Eris reappeared in front of him. Her blue eyes glowed in the darkness. The hunter barely had time to scream before she ended it. Silence fell over the battlefield. Ryan lowered his weapon, his breathing ragged. The fight was over. He turned toward Eris, who stood frozen, her hands shaking. She looked down at them, at the blood on her fingers, and her expression wavered. The mask of a warrior cracked, revealing the scared girl underneath. Nyx ran to her, grabbing her arm. Eris. Eris dropped the dagger and pulled Nyx close, burying her face in her sister's hair. Ryan watched them for a moment before stepping closer. "You okay?" Eris didn't answer. Ryan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He had seen that look before, the weight of taking a life. Even in war, it was never easy. But she had done what she had to do. He crouched down, meeting her gaze. "You saved us," he said gently. Eris swallowed hard, nodding. Ryan glanced at the bodies around them. They wouldn't be the last to come. But for now, they had won. He stood up, offering Eris his hand. She hesitated before taking it. Ryan pulled her up, then looked at Nyx. "We need to move." Nyx nodded, still clinging to her sister. Ryan took one last look at the battlefield, then turned toward the dark horizon. This fight wasn't over. Not yet. And he would do whatever it took to keep them safe. The air was thick with smoke, the scent of burnt metal and blood lingering in the atmosphere. Ryan's legs ached as he pushed forward, his body exhausted but his mind sharp. There was no room for hesitation now. The syndicate was closing in fast, and if they didn't keep moving, they would be surrounded. Eris and Nyx followed closely, their expressions filled with a mix of determination and fear. They had fought their way out of every trap so far, but this was different. The syndicate wasn't just sending bounty hunters anymore. This time, they had deployed something worse, something designed to eliminate problems quickly. Ryan's instincts screamed at him as he glanced at the distant sky. A low hum vibrated in the air. "They're bringing in drones," he muttered under his breath, gripping his rifle tighter. Eris stiffened. "What does that mean?" "It means we're running out of time," Ryan said, He could already hear the mechanical whir of approaching death. The Syndicate didn't take chances when it came to high-value targets. If ground forces failed, they sent drones, unmanned killing machines with no weaknesses, no hesitation, and no mercy. Ryan had seen them wipe out entire squads in minutes. They weren't built for capturing. They were built for extermination. He looked around, scanning for options. The terrain wasn't in their favor. They were trapped between the steep cliffside and the wreckage of a downed Syndicate ship. There was no cover, no easy escape. Eris gritted her teeth. We have to fight. Ryan shook his head. We won't win in an open battle. Not against those things. Nyx's voice was small but firm. Then what do we do? Ryan exhaled, mind racing. They needed a distraction. Something big, something that could buy them time. He looked at the wreckage, his mind piecing together a desperate plan. He turned to the twins. I'm going to rig the ship's core to blow. It'll take out the drones and the Syndicate forces nearby. Nyx's eyes widened. But you'll be. Yeah, Ryan cut in. Which is why you two need to keep running. Eris' hands clenched into fists. No, absolutely not. Ryan gave her a tired smirk. That wasn't a request. Before she could argue, the first drone appeared over the horizon, its sleek black frame cutting through the air like a silent predator. The others followed in formation, scanning the ground with eerie blue optics. Ryan's heart pounded. No more time. He sprinted toward the wreckage, ignoring Eris' protests. The ship's core was damaged, but still intact, just unstable enough that a few well-placed charges would turn it into a massive explosion. His fingers worked quickly, setting the detonators, his breath steady despite the chaos unfolding around him. The drones hovered closer, weapons charging. Syndicate soldiers were advancing from the west, their armored figures moving in deadly synchronization. Ryan clicked the last charge into place. Then, a shadow moved behind him. Eris. She had followed him, her face set with stubborn determination. I'm not leaving you, she said, her voice firm. Ryan gritted his teeth. Eris, you have to go. Nyx needs you. She needs both of us, Eris snapped. You think we survived this long just to let you throw your life away? Ryan hesitated. Then the first drone fired. He barely had time to shove Eris behind cover before the ground exploded beside them, sending dirt and metal flying. Syndicate soldiers opened fire from the west, their bullets tearing through the wreckage. Ryan returned fire, forcing them back, but they were outnumbered. Eris grabbed his arm. If you're staying, then so am I. Ryan stared at her, frustration and admiration clashing inside him. She wasn't just some helpless survivor anymore. She was a fighter. And she had made her choice. He let out a sharp breath. Fine, but we do this together. Eris nodded, grabbing her own weapon. Together, the battle erupted into chaos. Ryan and Eris fought side by side, taking down enemies as fast as they could. Nyx provided covering fire from a distance, her shots precise despite her trembling hands. The drones moved in, their cold, unfeeling optics locking onto Ryan. He dodged to the side as one fired, the blast missing him by inches. Another drone prepared to launch a missile. Eris sprinted forward, her body flickering as she activated her cloaking ability. The drone hesitated, its sensors unable to track her. Then she struck. Her knife plunged into its exposed wiring, and the drone shuddered before spiraling out of control, crashing into the cliffside in a burst of flame. Ryan didn't waste the opportunity. He raised his rifle, taking out another drone before it could react. The Syndicate soldiers hesitated, their formation breaking. They weren't prepared for a fight like this. Ryan smirked. Now's our chance. He activated the detonator. A loud beeping filled the air as the charges within the wrecked ship lit up. The Syndicate soldiers realized what was happening too late. Ryan grabbed Eris's wrist. Run. They bolted toward Nyx, who was already on the move. Behind them, the ship's core reached critical overload. Then, The explosion consumed everything. The force of the blast knocked them off their feet. Fire and metal filled the sky, the shockwave so strong it sent even the drones spiraling out of control. The Syndicate soldiers were obliterated in an instant, their bodies vanishing in the inferno. Ryan landed hard, pain jolting through his body. He groaned, forcing himself up, his vision swimming. Eris was beside him, coughing but alive. Nyx stumbled over, eyes wide with disbelief. The Syndicate was gone. The battlefield was silent. Ryan exhaled sharply, wiping blood from his forehead. Well, that worked. Nyx let out a shaky laugh. You're insane. Ryan grinned, but then he saw the look in Eris's eyes. She wasn't laughing. She was staring at him, a mix of relief and something deeper, something raw. You were really going to die for us, she whispered. Ryan's smirk faded. I told you. You're worth saving. Eris's breath hitched. For the first time since he had met them, she looked vulnerable. Not because of fear, but because she finally understood. Ryan had never seen her like this. And then she stepped forward, her hand brushing his. You saved us, she said softly. Now we're saving you. Ryan raised an eyebrow. What's that supposed to mean? Eris exchanged a glance with Nyx, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Then, Eris turned back to him, her blue eyes filled with an emotion Ryan couldn't quite place. It means we're staying with you, she said, no matter what. Ryan felt his chest tighten. He had spent his whole life fighting alone, protecting others. But this was different. This time, he wasn't alone. And for the first time, in a long, long time, Solara's voice was quiet but firm. Where are we going? Ethan didn't stop moving. The outskirts. We need to find allies. If we stay in the city, we're dead. She clenched her fists. My father is still up there. Ethan stopped and turned to her, his expression serious. Your father gave his life, so you could escape. We can't waste that. Solara took a shaky breath, but she nodded. She knew he was right, even if it broke her heart to accept it. They kept moving, their footsteps echoing through the underground passage. After what felt like hours, they finally reached the tunnel's exit. Ethan peered through the narrow opening before stepping out cautiously. The sight before them was worse than he had feared. The city was burning. Fires raged across the skyline, casting an eerie red glow over the metal structures. Smoke rose into the darkened sky, and the air was filled with the distant hum of warships circling above like vultures. The once great capital of the Silari Empire was now a battlefield. Solara inhaled sharply, her hands trembling. They really did it. Ethan felt anger burning in his chest. Yeah, and now we make them pay. But first, they needed an army. The rebels controlled the palace, and most of the royal forces had been wiped out. But there was still one place they could go, the slums. The lower districts of the city were home to the outcasts, the criminals, the forgotten soldiers who had been cast aside by the auxiliary elite. If there was any group that would be willing to fight against Zoreth, it was them. It was a risk, but it was the only chance they had. They moved quickly through the ruined streets, avoiding patrols and keeping to the shadows. The slums were quieter than usual, the usual neon lights flickering weakly as the power grid struggled to hold together. Ethan led Solara to an old warehouse, where he knew they would find the one person who could help them. As they stepped inside, dozens of eyes turned toward them. The room was filled with hardened warriors, Silari of different backgrounds, ex-soldiers, bounty hunters, and mercenaries. And standing at the center of it all was a towering figure with deep scars across his face. Korlak, the ex-general of the Silari military. He had been exiled years ago for defying the council's orders, but he had never stopped fighting. And now he might be their only hope. Korlak narrowed his eyes at them. I never thought I'd see the princess walking into my den. Solara lifted her chin. My father is dead. Zoreth has taken the palace. We need your help." The room fell silent. Then, Korlak let out a low chuckle. "You're either brave or foolish, girl." Ethan stepped forward. "We don't have time for games. Zoreth is tearing this city apart. You want revenge. Now's your chance." Korlak studied him for a moment before nodding. "You've got guts, human." He turned to his men. "Looks like we're going to war." Within hours, the underground rebellion was in motion. Korlak's forces spread through the city, gathering weapons, sabotaging enemy patrols, and spreading chaos among the rebels. They knew they were outnumbered, but they had the advantage of surprise. Zoreth's forces had grown arrogant, believing the war was already won. They were wrong. The final battle began at sunrise. The rebels struck hard and fast, launching attacks across the city. Explosions rocked the streets as Korlak soldiers stormed key outposts, taking back control of supply lines and weapons caches. The skies filled with dogfights as stolen fighters clashed against Zoreth's warships. Ethan and Silara fought side by side, cutting through enemy ranks with precision. She moved like a true warrior, her blade a blur of silver, while Ethan used every trick he had learned as a soldier. The fighting was brutal. Blood stained the streets, and bodies fell with every passing second. But the tide was turning. Then Zoreth himself entered the battlefield. The warlord descended from his flagship, his massive form clad in reinforced battle armor. His elite guards flanked him, cutting down rebels with ruthless efficiency. Silara's eyes burned with fury. "I'm ending this." She charged forward, blade in hand, and Ethan followed without hesitation. The final confrontation was brutal. Zoreth was fast, his strikes powerful, but Silara was faster. She dodged his attacks with grace, her blade cutting through his defenses. But he was strong, too strong. With a single strike, he sent her crashing to the ground, her weapon slipping from her grasp. He raised his sword for the final blow, and Ethan fired. The plasma bolt hit Zoreth square in the chest, staggering him. It was all the opening Silara needed. With a roar, she lunged forward, driving her blade deep into his heart. Zoreth's eyes widened in shock. Then, with one final gasp, he collapsed. The battlefield fell silent. The war was over. The rebels cheered, their victory secured. The remaining enemy forces surrendered, and by nightfall, the city belonged to them. Silara stood at the heart of it all, her father's legacy now resting on her shoulders. Ethan stepped beside her. "You did it." She turned to him, her expression soft. "We did it." And as the sun rose over the ruined city, a new era for the Auxiliary Empire began. The battlefield was silent. The war was over. The rebels stood victorious. The banners of the fallen royal family raised once again over the ruined palace. Fires still burned in the distance, smoke curling into the darkened sky, but the sounds of war had faded. Only the whispers of the dead remained. Ethan stood beside Silara, his body aching from the countless wounds he had taken. He had seen war before, had fought in battles that had tested his limits. But this was different. This was not just another war. This was a revolution. Silara, blood-stained and exhausted, turned to face him. Her silver eyes were unreadable, but Ethan could see the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. She had lost her father, her people had suffered, and now she was standing on the edge of a new future, one she had to build with her own hands. But the fight was not over. Not yet. A sharp, high-pitched noise echoed through the sky. Ethan's instincts kicked in immediately, and he grabbed Silara, pulling her down just as an explosion erupted near the palace gates. The rebels scattered, weapons raised, looking for the source of the attack. And then, through the smoke, the final enemy revealed itself. A warship descended from the sky, sleek and deadly, bearing the insignia of Zoreth's strongest ally, the Dominion, an empire known for its ruthless conquests. They had arrived too late to save Zoreth, but not too late to claim the throne for themselves. Ethan clenched his fists. "They're not giving up, are they?" Silara shook her head, her breathing unsteady. No, they want what Zoreth wanted. Power. From the warship, dozens of armored soldiers poured out, their weapons gleaming in the faint light of the burning city. At the center of them stood a towering figure, clad in dark battle armor. His voice boomed across the ruined palace. The HFY Empire belongs to the Dominion now. Surrender, and you will be spared. Sci-Fi stepped forward, standing tall despite the exhaustion weighing her down. My people will never bow to tyrants. The warlord let out a deep, mocking laugh. Your father said the same thing. And now he's dead. Ethan's grip tightened around his weapon. He knew what this meant. The battle wasn't truly over. Not yet. The Dominion was stronger, better equipped, and prepared to crush whatever resistance remained. The rebels had suffered too many losses already, their forces spread thin. If they fought here now, they would be wiped out. Sci-Fi turned to Ethan, her voice low. We can't win this. Ethan hated to admit it, but she was right. Not like this. Not with what little they had left. But there was still a way. It wasn't a battle they needed to fight with guns or blades. It was a battle of strategy, of sacrifice. Ethan turned to Korlak, the exiled general who had fought by their side. How many explosives do we have left? Korlak frowned but answered quickly. Enough to level this entire section of the city. That was all Ethan needed to hear. He looked at Sci-Fi, his heart heavy. Get your people out of here. She frowned, confused. What? No, we fight. We can't win this fight, Sci-Fi. Ethan interrupted. But we can make sure they don't win either. Realization dawned on her face. You're not. I am, Ethan said, his voice calm. Sci-Fi's hands clenched into fists. No. There has to be another way. There isn't. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm yet gentle. They want this city. They want the throne. We're not going to give it to them. She shook her head, anger and sorrow mixing in her gaze. Ethan, you don't have to do this. Yes, I do. He gave her a small smile, the kind that carried both regret and determination. You need to lead these people now. You need to build something better. Her breath hitched. Then fight with me. He wished he could. He really did. But this was the only way to make sure the future she wanted could exist. Ethan turned to Korlak. Take everyone and retreat. Get as far away from here as possible. Korlak studied him for a long moment before nodding. He understood. He always had. Sci-Fi, however, wasn't willing to accept it. I'm not leaving you. Ethan exhaled sharply. You have to. Her hands trembled as she grabbed his arm. Don't do this. He leaned in, his forehead pressing lightly against hers for just a brief second. You gave me a reason to fight for something more than just survival. Now let me do the same for you. Tears welled in her eyes, but she knew there was no changing his mind. And so, with a heavy heart, she turned away. The rebels moved quickly, retreating into the distant tunnels, vanishing into the night. Ethan stood alone now, facing the advancing army. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. The Dominion soldiers moved closer, their weapons aimed at him. The warlord sneered. Where is your army, human? Ethan smirked. Right under your feet. And with that, he pressed the detonator. A massive explosion erupted beneath the warlord's forces, engulfing them in flames and destruction. The palace crumbled. The very ground shaking this fire consumed everything in its path. The Dominion's warship tried to retreat, but the shockwave caught it, sending it spiraling into the ruins. It was over. The enemy had been destroyed. And Ethan was gone. Far from the ruined city, Sci-Fi stood atop a cliff, watching as the flames consumed what remained of the palace. Her hands were clenched at her sides, her heart aching with a loss she hadn't been prepared for. Korlak stood beside her, silent. The rebels had survived. The HFY Empire had a chance to rebuild. But the cost had been heavy. Sci-Fi closed her eyes, whispering a promise to the wind. I will honor you, Ethan. I will make sure your sacrifice wasn't in vain. And as the first light of dawn broke across the sky, the future of the Siluri Empire was born, not through conquest, but through the sacrifice of a single human who had fought, not for power, but for the hope of something greater.